After completing Vorador's mansion in the retail game, Kain is teleported to a cave just outside Uschtenheim to begin the trek through the ruined land to Dark Eden. However, in the alpha, the cave's not present, the teleporter doesn't work, and Uschtenheim as we know it either isn't present or is at least very different. This leaves us with some gaps to fill, and it's somewhat necessary to do some creative working backwards, using what we know of the progression from the finished game. So working backward down the trail from Dark Eden to its furthest extent leads us here. A marshy area in a new map section, which would seem a good place for a connection to the swampy Termagant forest. Although no opening is present at this time. Note the settlement to the west. We'll come back to that later on. Heading south and following the river trail along, it's possible to cross the waters several times and reach a new map area with some fields and huts. One hut stands alone on the banks of the river, but it cannot be entered. The river meets with a bridge at the south of the area, where it's possible to head further south into a series of tents, presumably a gypsy encampment similar to the one outside Vassabund.
These curious devices hurl bolts of whirling energy and eviscerate my human enemies by stripping ragged flesh from bloodstained bone.
Sadly, none of these can be entered.
As daylight chases darkness, the vampire's power wanes.
Heading north from the bridge takes us through an area with more huts that can't be entered, and through some fields. Here, the map area changes again, and takes us to the settlement proper. This area is not named, and shares virtually nothing in common with its retail equivalent, but the positioning on the map, and in the progression of the game, could suggest it was a prototype that was discarded or heavily reworked into the Uschtenheim we know. The settlement seen in the Alpha is a series of two-tiered log cabins with mud streets and wooden fortified walls. A stark contrast to the smaller and more modest collection of stone houses seen in the retail version of Uschtenheim. Unfortunately, none of the buildings can be entered, and the map areas that in the retail game cover the internal areas are not even in this version of the game. However, the signage does provide some clues, suggesting that the area would have had two pubs, an armoury and a blacksmith present. A curved cliff section at the end of a street leads into a small area with power-ups.
A medley of death and evisceration. Let fate choose my enemy's demise.
While to the north, an area can be found around the outside of the town, where more huts congregate around the outer cliffs, segregated from the rest of the community by fortified walls.
When conjured, the energy bank permits me access to mass amounts of magical energy for a brief period of time. However, when the moment passes, I will be drained of all magic, unable to cast even the simplest of spells.
To progress, we follow the trail northward to a far more familiar tile, the Ruined Land. The Ruined Land sections are very similar to their retail counterparts, except lacking the audio vistas and explanations given by Kain in retail. The first cave at the northeast of the area is not connected, but the retail version would suggest this was supposed to be for the blood fountain for increasing magic energy. That fountain is still present in the game and can be entered through the developer's level select, but its doorway doesn't lead anywhere.
Come, drink from us. Your magic energy recovers more quickly, for our blood enhances. Our blood enhances. Our blood preserves. Our blood heals. For the blood is the life.
Slightly further on is another cave in the cliff wall, but it's worth noting that this is in a slightly different position to the cave seen in retail, and part of the reason for this is that it's a completely different cave system. In retail, this cave led into a cavern which contained a large lava system and a number of secret items. Here, instead, we return to the Repel reshuffle discussed earlier, as this is the original Repel dungeon. The original Repel dungeon obviously isn't in the files of the retail game, and features much of the same design elements as the previous Bone Armor dungeon, but the dungeon begins with a simple cave with the Repel mural. This leads into the first decorated area, which contains another Repel mural and a balcony with an exit transporter. The next area has a vertical bridge which crosses some murky water below before leading up some stairs to a door on the left.
Reputed to have been ripped from the chest of the greatest vampire to have ever existed, Janos Audron, the Heart of Darkness restores vampiric unlife. Body.
Which leads to another pair of square sections, where Kain must defeat skeletons and activate a switch to open a door to move forward. The final room in the area has a series of time spikes blocking access to a pair of switches that must be activated to open the exit doorway, while a pair of leashes fire projectiles from a balcony on the left. Moving on, Kain could progress through a reverse C-shaped room to a staircase where the repel spell was found.
Invoking this spell cloaks me under a protective aegis. Whatever spell is cast at me will be reflected back at the caster, leaving me unharmed. It will only last for a short time, however, before leaving me vulnerable once more.
In the Alpha, the spell is much shorter lived than its retail counterpart. From here on, it was useful to use the spell against projectile throwing enemies and shooters seen through the dungeon. The next area contained a number of bridges and balconies over an area filled with water, with a diverse number of enemies. The penultimate chamber contains a series of wide square columns and is heavily populated by leashes and shooters. The final room is another area with a platform over murky water, with a teleporter which leads back to the beginning of the dungeon. The rest of the eastern section of the ruined land is much the same as retail. But moving on to the western section shows some changes. Here, along with some slightly different enemies and power-ups, the obstacles have been rearranged, appearing to channel the player south towards a branching section. This branching area is slightly altered in retail to accommodate a moon gate positioned across it. The cave at the end of the trail is again not connected, but in retail this would be the main entrance to the Heart of Darkness Spirit Forge. That area is present and can be accessed through the developer's level select,
Shed your blood for me.
which reveals it as having a smaller entrance chamber, but no other changes. However, it isn't connected to the outside world. The rest of the western ruin land has much the same layout as retail, albeit missing the vista points. The fiery rain seen here is seen in the retail version, although it's relatively rare.
From the heavens, the tears of angels danced around me in a frenzy of fire.
The last area of the ruined land begins the lava theme consistent with the Heart of Dark Eden. But it's largely the same as its retail counterpart, save for minor differences with enemies and power-ups.
I employ, this is perhaps the cruelest, causing my victim's body to shrink on itself, crushing bones and rupturing organs till the pressure inside bursts the sack of fleshy skin, spraying its contents for all to see. A medley of death and evisceration. Let fate choose my enemy's demise. These curious devices hurl bolts of whirling energy and eviscerate my human enemies by stripping ragged flesh from blood-stained bone.
Join us next time as we head into the next area and the heart of Dark Eden.